Okay, cool.
She's just preparing.
Yeah, this is so handy. I've never presented on a Mac before. I didn't know I could do that.
Welcome, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Friday morning session of the 19th Annual ISTF Conference at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. We're really glad that you could join us this morning. Our theme this year is Food and Forest, Cultivating Resilient Landscapes. Today we're going to start with a talk by Anna Horforth, followed by a panel on Beyond Yields, Food Security and Resilience. After lunch, we'll have a panel on reconciling interests at the landscape scale. You'll then have a chance to participate in either a workshop on facilitating multi-stakeholder dialogues or 2 of 3 discussions about nutrition, gender, or rights. We'll end the day with a reception and a poster session. If you're at any point unsure where to go or what's going on, look for a Yale ISTF member. You can recognize us by the green dots on our ID badges. And I want to mention that the bathrooms, the women's bathroom is right back there, and the men's bathroom is outside the auditorium and in the back. And we're so pleased to have Anna Horforth here with us to give this morning's introductory address. She'll also be moderating one of the afternoon discussions on nutrition and conservation with Selena Ahmed, who'll be talking in panel 1. Anna is a consultant specializing in nutrition as a multi-sectoral issue related to agriculture and the environment. She consults for the World Bank, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and USAID's Spring project. She's also a visiting fellow at Cornell University. She's worked with universities, nonprofit organizations, agencies of the United Nations, and CGIAR on nutrition policy and programs in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. Anna?
Thank you. Can you hear me through the mic? Okay. So thank you, Julia and Karen and all the organizers of this conference. I think it's really wonderful that you're having the theme on food and forests, and I'm so pleased to be here because usually I'm surrounded by the nutrition world and to a lesser extent the agriculture world, and as you'll see through the presentation, I believe that sustainable food production is critical for many reasons, including nutrition. And I really believe that we need enhanced collaboration with conservation. So I'm so happy to see these themes coming together here at Yale for this conference. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is give you an introduction to what I live and breathe in the nutrition world, what food security and nutrition means and what the global movement is on those agendas. And I also look forward to learning a lot from you, from more of the forestry and conservation side on how we can come together. And I'd also like to acknowledge my collaborator, Selena Ahmed, and I always learn a lot from her. She's an expert in conservation biology and biodiversity. So we thought through a lot of these ideas together that I'm going to talk about today. So since we're here to talk about food and forests, I think we might as well start by talking about what's food. What do we mean by food? And why are we talking about food? So it has something to do with human well-being. And I believe that one of the best ways to think about human well-being is nutrition, because it reflects so much of your internal and external environment and determines so much of human potential. So I'll tell you more about what I mean by that, but just think to yourself for a moment, when you hear the word food, think about your own life. What does food mean? So just think about it and hold the thought. And I was thinking about this myself, what do I mean when I talk about food? And I think for me, I could best say what I think food is something that we eat to be nourished. And food security is something that has to include that idea. And fortunately, the agreement on what food security means, agreed by 182 heads of state in the UN, really does include that concept of food as something you need to be nourished. So I think we should start by getting all on the same page about what is food security. And this is the definition that was agreed to by all the countries at the World Food Summit back in 1996, and it still is what institutions have signed on to. So food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for a healthy and active life. This may be a little bit different from what's commonly kind of used as a term food security. Often there are two words in this in particular that get forgotten. And those are physical access to food. So we definitely have moved towards knowing that economic access, incomes are important for food security, but that's not enough. You also need to have physical access to be able to conveniently get nutritious food. And if you're living in a very remote place where a market's far away, you don't necessarily have physical access, even though you may have economic access. And then nutritious food. So it's not just about calories, it's about all of the foods that you need for a healthy and active life. So to really, I think this is such an important concept to keep in mind that when we talk about food security, that we're talking about nutritious diets. I was thinking, maybe something that you can always remember about what food security really means is how many of you, when you have packed your suitcases for a trip to a tropical country, have put in some extra granola bars, power bars, and peanut butter, and maybe vitamins in your suitcase? I definitely have. And why do we do that? It's because we are worried that when we get to a new place, we may be temporarily food insecure. We may be unable to access sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So we talk about coping mechanisms sometimes. This is a way to cope and make sure that we have food security. But just, you can hold that in your mind for when you hear food security. What does that really mean? And then also, so yes, summarized as consistent access to diverse diets. And diets are then the link between food security and nutrition. So diets are not only influenced by the kinds of foods that you have access to, but they're also influenced by your environment and your internal needs. So your physical environment, what kind of food is available, accessible, convenient, your social environment, what kind of food is socially acceptable and are most people eating, and your culture. So what kind of food is acceptable to you? So maybe if you go to the Amazon rainforest, maybe something that people would be eating are roasted caterpillars. Is that something that is going to go into your diet? Is that something that fits with your culture that you're going to accept? And it may depend on social environment and who else is eating with you as well. So diets really reflect the internal individual needs and the external environment. And as I said, the link from food security to nutrition. So this basic framework is a nutritionist worldview. And I'll show you where food security and diet fit in. So the mantra of nutritionists is food, health, and care. Because access to food, which is food security, maternal and child care practices, and also health services and healthy environments all contribute to your diet and your health. And together, those are what determine your nutrition. Because you may have very good food security, you may eat a good diet, but if you are very sick, if you have diarrhea, you may not be absorbing the nutrients in that food, and you may end up having poor nutrition. And also the kind of food that you end up eating depends on how you're being fed, if you're a small child, by probably your mother or your caretakers. So food, health, and care ultimately determine nutrition. And just to show how that fits with the healthy environments, they have to be free from contaminants and disease vectors so they don't contribute to poor health. And also, this will come up a little bit later as well, women's decision-making power, income and time and knowledge also are something important, and that'll come up later. And again, this is food security. So the top of this framework here, nutrition, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means. And a lot of times it's reflected in body size. Nutritionists often measure nutrition in terms of a child's growth or body size or biochemical indicators in the blood of iron status or vitamin A status. And this is, a lot of times actually nutrition is invisible. So here, you might think that this is a older brother and a younger brother. But in fact, these two children are the same age. They're both 3 years old. And this child was malnourished as a baby, and as a result is severely stunted. So stunted means having low height for age. So this child is shorter than he should be compared to normal growth, which is his friend here. But just looking at that child, it's, he's not terribly skin and bones. You wouldn't necessarily know that this child is stunted unless you knew how old he was. So, okay, if stunting, malnutrition, a lot of times is small body size. Why is that important? So he's surviving. He's overcome this period of malnutrition. But what does it actually, what's the danger and the consequences of malnutrition? So it took a while for the nutrition community to really get our story straight on this. And there was some very significant research that showed, so this is what used to be considered the cause of child mortality. So you have all of these infectious diseases, and nutrition is nowhere on here. Severe nutrition, actual starvation, accounts for very, very few deaths in the world. So, does nutrition have anything to do with child death? Well, it turns out it has a lot to do with child mortality. Malnutrition is actually the single largest cause of child mortality because it interacts with disease. So if you have a disease, any one of these diseases, and are also malnourished, then you're much more likely to actually die from that disease. So child deaths from infectious disease are often the combination of the disease itself and malnutrition. So research that showed this interaction really, this was in the mid-90s, that showed that malnutrition is actually extremely important to life. And then also beyond just the life and death issue, there are consequences of malnutrition even for those who survive. So child malnutrition is associated with increased mortality, increased illness, also reduced cognitive development. So stunting early on, usually people lose the ability to develop fully cognitively, lose IQ points, and that's been well documented. Reduced schooling, so beyond just the physical, mental ability, also reduced opportunities through schooling. Children who are malnourished go to school later. Reduced worker revenues, so over a lifetime, usually more than a 10% loss in income from early malnutrition. And then that translates to reduced GDP at the national level of 2 to 3%, which are World Bank estimates. And this is just to show where the malnutrition primarily occurs. There's a lot of focus on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, a little bit in Latin America and Southeast Asia as well, but really a lot of the focus in a lot of these discussions is sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia. And that's reflected again, this is, the red dots are child mortality, and also it's related to poor diets, of course. So vitamin A deficiency is found in the same same regions, and anemia. And anemia would have to do with both poor diets and also infectious diseases that contribute to that. A few years ago, nutrition had a real turning point with the Lancet series on maternal and child undernutrition. And I don't think there's ever been a series of papers that's been this influential, at least in my knowledge. So this series of papers really, it did a couple of things. It pulled together all the research on what we know about the causes and consequences of malnutrition and for whom those happen most and where the consequences are most severe. And it clarified that there's a window of opportunity for nutrition of pregnancy and the first 2 years of life. So from -9 to 24 months. And somebody looked at that time range and was very clever and realized that it's 1,000 days. So now we talk about it as 1,000 days. And this is when malnutrition is most likely to occur and when it has the most severe and often irreversible consequences. And it also defined a set of evidence-based direct nutrition interventions to reach that age range. So things like enhanced breastfeeding, things like delivering vitamin A supplements, things like curative services for malnourished children. And those direct nutrition interventions led to a coalescence of advocacy around the target age range and also the interventions. At the same time, there was a global food crisis going on around 2008. So it just sort of happened that this nutrition advocacy and the global food crisis were going on at the same time, and there's this opportunity for nutrition to be kind of inserted as a corollary objective to new agriculture and food security initiatives that were coming out of that food price crisis. So there's now the 1,000 Days initiative from that pregnancy, first 2 years of lifetime period. Hillary Clinton, speaking, improving nutrition for mothers and children is one of the most cost-effective, impactful tools we have for poverty alleviation and sustainable development. A lot of advocacy around the 1,000 Days. There's this little girl here who is supposed to, rouse compassion and interest in this. And then we also have agriculture programs. There's the same little girl. Nutrition has become sort of part of agriculture programs. And also, agriculture has kind of infiltrated into nutrition programs here. So you see this picture supposed to represent who we're talking about within the scaling up nutrition movement. And that's also like the 1,000 Days movement. This scaling up nutrition movement is something new that came out of this new evidence base from 2008. And it is a coalition of partners. There's over 100 partners who have signed on to the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, the Scaling Up Nutrition framework. And this has never happened before in nutrition. So this is really there's a lot of energy around nutrition that hasn't been there before. And this Scaling Up Nutrition framework, which all of these institutions signed, basically says we need 2 approaches to improve nutrition. And the first is to scale up these evidence-based direct interventions, nutrition-specific interventions, we call them. For prevention and treatment, the highest priority to the first 1,000 days. But then it also says, what everyone signed on to here, to take a multi-sectoral approach to nutrition, primarily through agriculture and social protection, health, education, water, gender, governance. All of these sectors, if you remember the framework, all of those lead into the underlying causes of nutrition, food, health, and care. So we can't ignore those. However, at this point, the SUN framework really focuses on the first set, so the nutrition-specific interventions. And it's very, very specific. It has this table that says this is what we're going to do. We're going to do breastfeeding. We're going to do vitamin A supplements. We're going to do zinc. We're going to do iron, cell iodization. All of this is great. But then when you get to the multi-sectoral side, it's just we need to do it. But there's nothing about what we do or how we do that. So how do we improve nutrition from agriculture? I mean, it's clear to people agriculture is essential for nutrition as a producer of food. There's a large proportion of the world's poor who are farmers. Particularly now, there's renewed investments in agriculture, so there's actually an opportunity to do something, whereas in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't even much going on in agriculture, let alone nutrition. So now we have the opportunity to work with agriculture. And now I'm just going to go through a little bit of why, what are people saying about, why do we need to especially work with agriculture for nutrition? I mean, why isn't it enough just to have this agriculture investments? Why does nutrition even need to be partnering with these things? If ag is just producing food, isn't that enough? Well, it's definitely not enough because the current state is that we have 870 million hungry in the world, and 2 billion have hidden hunger, which is a term that we use about micronutrient deficiencies. So being low in essential vitamins and minerals, you can't necessarily see it, but it's going to lead to that reduced cognitive development, reduced incomes, reduced schooling, so hidden hunger. And then also, there's 1 billion overweight and obese, and that's growing every day. So when we invest in agriculture, nutrition impacts might be positive or negative. And you have to look at the whole picture of nutrition. And there's a lot of evidence that calorie production and economic growth are not sufficient to solve nutrition problems. And these have been the main goals so far. Calorie production is related to undernutrition. There's a positive relationship as you increase the amount of calories available in a nation. It improves nutrition at low levels of calories. That's when there are severe deficits in calories. And this is on average. So in any given country, this relationship may be stronger or weaker. But the Millennium Development Goal 1, to have poverty and hunger by 2015, when we look at the two indicators there, the percent hungry and the percent underweight, since we're close to 2015, now we can see there are 21 countries that have already met the goal of reduced hunger. But of those, only 6 are on track to meet the underweight goal. So just that shows you that you can meet the Millennium Development Goal for hunger and by producing a lot of calories. But that's rarely going to do much about nutrition. So there are very few countries that have actually met both goals. And why is that? Well, this is for sub-Saharan Africa. Calorie production usually focuses on starchy roots and cereals. And what we can see here is that the amount of starchy roots and cereals available per capita, if it were equally distributed, which of course it's not, but if it were, there would actually be enough, more than enough for everybody in sub-Saharan Africa. But then when you look at other dietary components, so pulses and fruits and vegetables, these dotted lines represent what would be needed for, in the case of pulses, for adequate protein in combination with starches, and for fruits and vegetables, what's recommended by the World Health Organization and the FAO, and for both micronutrients and prevention of chronic disease. And I mean, even if it were perfectly distributed, there's nowhere near enough of these kinds of foods. So a focus on calorie production has not taken into account food security, has not taken into account all the foods needed for healthy and active lives. Those are not even available enough, much less accessible. So calorie production alone, not sufficient to eliminate food insecurity. You can get that just from the definition. It's not sufficient to eliminate undernutrition, as we have evidence for. It's definitely not going to reduce overweight, since more calories is not going to help the overweight problem. And again, underscoring food means all diverse foods, not equal to calories, so calorie production, not really the ideal goal when you're talking about food security. Also, GDP, increase in economic growth has also been something that agriculture traditionally strives for, but that is also not the ideal goal when you're talking about nutrition, because as GDP rises, there is a correlation with stunting, that poorer countries tend to have more stunting and richer countries have less stunting, but it's the opposite for obesity. So as GDP grows, you're kind of trading nutritional problems. So it has some correlation with undernutrition, but that's not the full picture. And it's also not as if we can categorize countries into the obesity box or the undernutrition box. In most countries, there are both problems. So this is a chart of all. Well, these are many of the countries that were kind of highlighted in the map, which have very high burdens of stunting, and were identified in the Lancet series as high priority countries for undernutrition. Nearly a third of those countries identified as high priority undernutrition countries also have overweight and obesity of over 40%. So it is both problems at the same time all over the world. And so again, here's the map of stunting, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, projected increases in diabetes, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia. So it's, thinking about nutrition is the full picture, and it has a lot to do with diet quality. And so just one of the quotes from a colleague at the International Food Policy Research Institute: sadly, it seems we've somehow managed to bypass good health, moving from hunger to obesity in a single generation in many parts of the world. So what's going on? Well, diets are changing. This is a picture that I took in my research area in Tanzania. I could have taken it at any school. There was Coca-Cola signs on every single school. Kind of the same thing that's going on here with pouring rights and advertisement to children. And this is, there are cultural changes going on around diets. Also McDonald's, it's not as if McDonald's and Coca-Cola themselves are causing all obesity, but it's useful to look at as a symbol, as a representation of cultural changes and what's considered valuable and the kind of food people strive to consume and what's available and what's cheap. So these are growing all over the world. This recently, they weren't in Africa before, but again, a representation of changing food environments and what that might mean. And this is really what we're talking about is decline in traditional food culture. Has to do with media and advertising, also environments. Has been called McDonaldization, Coca-Colanization. This is sort of riffing on how in many parts of the world, in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, colonization actually was a major force in changing dietary habits to start with, and now we talk about Coca-Colonization, not just colonization. So these play a role in social construction of desirable foods. And places with traditional food culture have been shown to have less problems with obesity, and there are examples across all national income levels, Mediterranean diets. South Korea is a good example. There's some small pockets of examples in Sub-Saharan Africa. And globalization really emphasizes uniformity, and when you're talking about transportation and marketing, often rejects foods not easily available or recognizable. So part of this decline in traditional food culture has to do with a decline in biodiversity. So at least 7,000 plant species have been used for human food, but today only 15 crops and 8 animals provide 90% of the world's calories. And over the past 100 years, over 90% of crop varieties have been lost from fields and also livestock breeds. And this really has profound nutritional consequences, because it's not only does genetic uniformity open ourselves to the risk of large-scale crop failure and huge food insecurity that way, but also diversity, rich diversity in our diet provides a variety of nutrients and also phytochemicals that buffer against both undernutrition and chronic disease. And this is, I think, one of the frontiers of nutrition science. We've established the micronutrients. There's still much, much more to be done on establishing health benefits of other components of food. So for example, fiber, not a nutrient, but extremely important to nutrition and health. lutein, zeaxanthin are some phytochemicals that are now very well recognized for their health benefits. And we have many more of those to discover and characterize. And I know Celine is going to talk some about that in her presentation. Okay, just a representation here of the huge loss of varieties if you look at specific species, when you're talking about how to transport them and sell them, 80, 90 years go by and there are very few varieties. That means less diversity in terms of nutrients and phytochemicals. And then diets also have profound impacts on other aspects of the environment beyond biodiversity. So agriculture and climate change, I think probably everyone in the room knows the answer to this. When we're talking about diets and climate change, which causes more greenhouse gas emissions, rearing cattle or driving cars, livestock sector, 18% more greenhouse gas emissions than driving cars. And it's not just the methane production and transportation, of course. This audience will well know that it has much to do with forest clearing for new pastures, not for just the animals themselves, but for example, for the soy production in Brazil that's going to feed animals in China, which is going to feed people, making them obese and at risk for chronic disease, basically. And then we also have other issues of the environment and diets, how agriculture is using water. Again, this relates to livestock, but also other kinds of food production. And water withdrawals are, again, quite a serious issue in these same areas of highest malnutrition. So we have agricultural food systems that are not functioning well for nutrition, and they're not functioning well for the environment. So with all of that to describe nutrition, when we look back at where nutritionists are putting the majority of their advocacy right now in these direct nutrition interventions, which are very important to child survival, obviously they're not broad enough. So one of the efforts to try to broaden this nutrition agenda, and where we need to join forces with conservation, is in guidance for agriculture. So how to do agriculture in a way that's better for nutrition and also better for the environment. So one of the things I've worked on recently for FAO was to synthesize guidance for agriculture programming on nutrition. Now, since this 2008 nutrition movement, 2008 food crisis, there have been over 50 publications and statements from various development institutions about how to improve agriculture for nutrition. So I read through all of these and tried to find what's the bottom line. What are people saying the same things? What is the advice in general? Like, is it possible? So the Sun movement characterized the table 1 about direct nutrition interventions. Is it possible to actually say something meaningful about what to do in agriculture, other than just that we need to do it? So my approach to this was looking at all of the advice that international development institutions have already published. And it turns out there was a huge amount of convergence around the main messages of what all of these institutions were saying. And they boiled down to a set of core principles. And I'm not going to go through all of them here today, but some of the key ones I'll just go through for the purposes of our discussion. So one of the key messages is incorporating explicit nutrition objectives. So not just assuming that whatever we do in agriculture, growing calories, growing dollars, whatever that it's going to automatically translate to nutrition, because we know that's not true. So to start, we need to say that we want agriculture to actually do something good for nutrition, so to have that objective. And then to measure impact through monitoring and evaluation. So it's not good enough to have an objective, but to also follow, are programs and investments doing anything to follow steps along the way to improve nutrition? to work within context, so to take advantage of the resources that are available in a particular place, what's possible to grow, what the agroecosystem is, what resources are in that ecosystem that could contribute to nutrition, and to build on that more than just coming with an outside idea or intervention and assuming it will work. Targeting the vulnerable, so really working with vulnerable farmers, smallholders, women, indigenous groups, and not only larger farms that would be more efficient at calorie production and income production. The ones in the middle in blue are ones that were sort of core principles that it seemed like most institutions were saying you really need to do in every case. So empowering women is a critical one because a lot of women are farmers, and there's very good evidence that women's income leads very directly to improved nutrition of all household members, more so than overall household income or men's income. There's a very close connection between women's income and nutrition. So empowering women economically, but also their time. So reducing the time they have to spend on many different tasks so that they can spend that time better on the, caring for children and not letting that go by because there's so many other tasks to do, or caring for the household. These are roles that women have whether they like it or not everywhere in the world. So women's time use is a very big issue in addition to women's income. Then incorporating nutrition education, so partly general nutrition education, hygiene and behaviors, but also information about specific foods and why to value specific foods. So why some of these traditional food resources are actually valuable nutritional resources and not just famine foods, or not just something to discard once you have enough money to go buy a McDonald's. So nutrition education is something a lot of institutions said. Also, so this is where we really come together. It was interesting to me that almost every institution talked about managing natural resources as a route from agriculture to nutrition. And in all of the different guidance notes, some various things that were brought up were soil, water, biodiversity, and climate, and how those relate to food production in some of the ways that I went over earlier. And basically the bottom line is that natural resources are critical to the livelihoods and resilience of vulnerable farmers and sustainable food and nutrition security for all. So it's not enough to think about just immediate short-term food security. We have to think long-term. And even if we're thinking about immediate food security, we're talking about farmers living on landscapes which, if resources aren't conserved, those landscapes could be non-viable in the very near future. So it's both for the present and future, talking about natural resources. And I'll come back to this more. Then some of the other principles were diversifying production, so not just focusing on staple crops, and increasing production of nutrient-dense foods, and also with that, increasing market access and opportunities. And this is really to say that subsistence is not what is being recommended. There's a recognition that many people are semi-subsistence, but most people really strive to earn incomes from their environments and from their agriculture. So increasing those opportunities in a way that supports those vulnerable for what they can produce well, and also for what's nutritious. So an example of that is, this is a project that I worked on in East Africa, where the project was promoting traditional African vegetables. And these are very well adapted to the environment with very low resources. Many of them are wild foods, but they can also be cultivated in fields. So this program was trying to promote these both on the production side and also on the marketing side, so that nutrition education and markets principle coming together. So what this organization did, this guy is from Farm Concern International, they used an approach of nutrition-focused marketing to consumers and farmers. They took these wild leafy vegetables and were marketing them in Nairobi supermarkets based on their nutritional qualities, high in vitamin A, high in iron. They also had, in Swahili, they were called dawa, which means medicine. So they also had medicinal characteristics. A lot of people said that they prevented diabetes. So marketing them, to serve the purpose of both reducing undernutrition and reduce problems with obesity and chronic disease. And this is Wangi from Farm Concern talking to the farmers. And it wasn't just men, by the way. Women are mostly the one who grow these vegetables, and they were targeted, but they're somehow not in this picture. And this is the same information being used in the supermarket here with a promotion around traditional African vegetables. And we talk about nutrition-sensitive economic growth. So economic growth that promotes diversified diets with local resources that are sustainable to produce, also empowering women so that they have that income to use for nutrition. It's kind of the whole package of the way that economic growth and agriculture could support nutrition and environment. And I know that Selena is also going to talk about this in her presentation with how you can use quality of food, nutrition or phytochemistry, to influence consumers to demand that food more. And I also want to bring in these same concepts are being discussed. This was a meeting just last month where the Sackler Institute of the New York Academy of Sciences launched a new research agenda. And I was part of the working group, so I was presenting this research agenda last month, and our group decided that this is like the crux of the research agenda, is how to bring together nutrition, environmental sustainability, and economic profitability, and that policies and interventions and guidelines can move these circles closer together or farther apart. Then there's also, very recently, there's the new UN Zero Hunger Challenge, which has been unveiled before as a post-Millennium Development Goals agenda. And these are the targets as of now. They may change, but this is the first version of them. So 100% access to adequate food year-round, zero stunted children, all food systems are sustainable, 100% increase in smallholder farmer productivity and income, and zero loss or waste of food. So all of this to say, there's been a lot of recent movement on the nutrition agenda. Even more recently, there's been a lot of movement on, okay, that narrow agenda on nutrients isn't enough. We also need to talk about farming and farmers' livelihoods and environmental sustainability. So there's actually quite a lot of talk about this in the nutrition community. But especially for the environmental sustainability piece, how are we going to be accountable to this? So, conservation is very often stated, but it's not part of any nutrition results framework in a serious way. I mean, the Zero Hunger Challenge here has all food systems are sustainable. But what kind of results are we looking for? Are we just saying that? There's no results framework I know of in a nutrition project that would actually measure anything having to do with sustainability. And I think when you would say this to most nutritionists, they would say, well, yeah, sustainable is important, but it's not the strongest link to nutrition. I mean, it's important, but if I'm actually just going to spend my scarce resources measuring like what I do for nutrition, I don't even know what to measure. And I'm not even sure what time scale I'm looking for effects. So I want to go through, and this will lead into the discussion that Selena and I are going to facilitate this afternoon. So as I go through these indicators that are usually used, I'd really like to have a discussion with you all about how we can come up with indicators to be used together that would, so that conservation projects could take more account nutrition, and nutrition could somehow really take conservation into account seriously. So these are the kind of results that are usually measured. This is, again, this framework of food, health, and care. And at the top, nutritional status is usually the primary thing that nutritionists want to measure for nutrition impact. And these are indicators of stunting, low height for age, underweight, which is just being too small for age, anemia and vitamin A status. Then in the next level, we often measure dietary quality. And we can talk more about these specific indicators if you're interested, but I'm just going to give a basic overview. So dietary quality oftentimes can be measured with individual dietary diversity scores. So you ask people, it's a very simple thing to do. You have basically like 8 or 12 food groups, and you go through and you say, did you eat any starches yesterday, such as rice or corn? Yes or no. Did you eat any fruits yesterday, such as da, 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 yes or no? And so you can come up with a score from 0 if you ate nothing to 12 if you ate all of the food groups, and that's well correlated with dietary quality. So the higher the diversity, the higher the micronutrient and calorie adequacy of your diet. And then some people still measure nutrient consumption, but that's much less simple. That requires very intensive questionnaires about what exactly you ate and the amounts, and then calculating nutrient composition out of all those foods. But sometimes nutritionists do that. Then there's food security. So unfortunately, there's no one indicator of food security. Food security is a very elusive concept, and the best you can do is to measure different aspects of it and try to understand if your intervention or your policy is changing any of those aspects of food security. So, mostly when people have used a food security indicator, it's been the FAO indicator of caloric availability. When you look at food insecurity maps of the world, that's what it is, it's calories. But obviously, as you should all know and never ever forget, that doesn't represent food security. That only represents a very small part of food security, how many calories you have. So there are other indicators of food security too, and we can go into those in detail, but they're, they have to do with household dietary diversity, the kinds of whether households can access diverse diets, also experiential measures. So like in the US, the way that we measure food insecurity is by asking people, are you worried about food? Did you go to bed hungry? Things like that. So your experience of it. So there's different measures. In this level, so there's the healthy environments level here. And this is where I put a question that we should discuss. So are there indicators? There's no indicators I know of used in nutrition of the healthfulness of environments which lead to disease and dietary intake. So we might want to think about that as a level of conservation indicators. And then down under the basic causes, we measure income, and we are starting to measure women's empowerment, because again, this feeds back into maternal and child care. Women's empowerment is really hard to measure, but there are efforts to come up with indicators for it because it's so important. And the ecosystem services that support food security and environments are also so important. But I don't know of any indicators to measure them in nutrition projects. So I think what we might want to think about in terms of, okay, how do we go forward measuring how ecosystem services affect nutrition is to think about our objectives. So aligning the objectives between conservation and nutrition for research priorities. So we have these various nutrition objectives: improving dietary quality, increasing micronutrient intake, improving maternal and child care and feeding, access to clean water for drinking, for washing, hygiene, protecting health, avoiding disease, increasing equity, increasing food security. These are all kind of basic objectives of nutrition. And conservation, we have conserving biodiversity and maintaining ecosystem services and all of the pieces of ecosystem services. And we can start to connect these. So, there's a lot of potential connections that we can discuss. But for example, the ecosystem service of fresh water obviously links to access to clean water for drinking and hygiene. Also, it links to maternal and child care and feeding, because water collection is a major drain on women's time. So if you want to increase the amount of time women have for providing care to families, as they need to do no matter what, you need to decrease the amount of time they spend on things like fetching water. Same goes for fuel. Fuel collection, major drain on women's time. Regulating infectious disease risk is a potential ecosystem service that could be measured, which has a lot to do with protecting health and in that way improving nutrition. Soil has to do with increasing food security. It's a basic foundation for crop production, and also micronutrient intake depending on what's in that soil that goes into the crops. Food obviously relates to dietary quality, and biodiversity relates to a whole bunch of these objectives. And I think the links there need to be clarified in future research. So some forestry relevant models that link ecological and nutrition objectives. Selena and I talked about these, and we'd like to discuss them more with you this afternoon. But one of them would be agroforests, and the nutrition objectives here that agroforests could reach are food security, dietary quality, and income. Integrated forest agricultural landscapes could have to do with equity, and they have to do with dietary quality again and income. Mixed cropping could have to do with nutrition objectives of food security and dietary quality. And again, like these could have to do with a lot more nutrition objectives, but these are just the first ones that come to mind. And structurally and functionally diverse gardens have a lot to do with dietary quality and women's empowerment. There's actually a fair amount of literature on this in the nutrition world, home gardens and nutrition outcomes. And then tree planting, equity, women's empowerment, dietary quality, if you're talking about certain kinds of trees that grow nutritious foods. And I just am referencing the Greenbelt movement here because Wangari Maathai, one of her initial objectives with the tree planting it was intimately tied with women's empowerment. And then that empowerment being very important to the well-being of households and partly through their nutrition. So I think there's a lot of links that we can make, but we need to show them. So we need to show how forests lead to ecosystem services and how those connect to nutrition. And we need to then improve our messages so that, I think we're stronger at changing the shape of agriculture together through both nutrition and conservation. But we need to improve our messages on how we're linked together and then to generate evidence along this pathway to influence policy. And I'll just introduce very briefly one of the messages that has been started to be promoted. It's still not used a whole lot, but one of FAO's messages on these links is sustainable diets. And FAO's definition of this is diets with low environmental impacts which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair, affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, and optimizing nutrition and human resources. So this was definitely put together by a committee. It's a very, so the message of sustainable diets probably is a good one, maybe could be further clarified so that people understand what it means, but I think it does start to bring together the nutrition and conservation agendas. So we need some metrics to influence decisions. Biodiversity has a research agenda on sustainable diets metrics, and we need to think together with the forestry community on what ecological metrics nutrition can use, what nutrition indicators that could be relevant and applicable in forestry, because what gets measured gets managed. And otherwise, if we're not measuring, we're just going to continue to use sustainability as a word that would be nice. And I hope that if I leave you with only one thing that you'll remember is in your projects, in your research and your analysis, do not use calorie availability as synonymous with nutrition, because that will just continue to lead us down the wrong path of ways of production that are not supporting nutrition and are not supporting conservation. So again, in our discussion this afternoon, we're going to talk with you about how to join forces effectively. What policies and what institutions do we need to work with? We have agreements such as this Zero Hunger Challenge. We have networks such as the Scaling Up Nutrition, the RED program. We have global institutions such as the UN, the World Bank, and the CGR institutions. We have regional institutions like the African Comprehensive Agriculture Development Program, national and local levels. So where is it that we can join forces effectively in all of these different levels? So I think to end that nutrition within conservation, it really epitomizes a people-centered approach. And I think people-centered approaches are what moves policy. Orangutans can only move policy so much. I think people-centered approaches are really what policymakers mostly strive for. And that nutrition is all about human growth and human potential and health. And this is important to forestry because it really shows that it's not people versus forests, as was said in the keynote yesterday. But it's that people it's people with forests, and that forests are essential to all people and provide essential ecosystem services. So I think we need to work together more and talk more, and I think there's no better place to start than here today at this conference. Thank you.
We have time for some quick clarifying questions. We'll also have her in the panel, so keep that in mind if we don't have time to get to your question right now.
Okay, so if it's only a clarifying question, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. For a clarifying question, on the bar chart you showed of the 3 food categories in sub-Saharan Africa and how much are being produced and how much we need, I had 2 questions. So first of all, was that, you said that there's enough grains and starchy roots produced to actually feed it if distribution was fair? Is all of that what's being produced actually staying in Africa? So is that only looking at domestic markets, or is that stuff that will largely maybe go overseas?
Oh,
and
yeah, good question.
The other question is, you only showed pulses and how much we need to meet protein requirements. So is that a pulse equivalent of protein, or are you suggesting that pulses would be sufficient to meet protein requirements without animal sources at all?
Okay, yeah. So just to clarify those points, all those different food categories, including the starchy roots and grains, those are all food available within countries. So those, you could also look at food production, which is stuff for export as well as domestic, but that was specifically food available in the country, so it's not leaving the country, or the region in this case. And then with pulses, that calculation was how much would be available in combination with starches to meet protein. So there's no nutritional need for animal products for adequate protein. A lot of times animal products are expedient for protein, but there's actually no nutritional need for animal products for meeting protein requirements. You can meet your protein requirements with pulses plus grains. So that's what that calculation was. It was assuming, just for the sake of simplicity, assuming no animal source food consumption. Of course, now when you add animal source food consumption, it would go down a little bit, but on average in sub-Saharan Africa, animal source food consumption is very low. So just showing, what would be needed to increase sort of most quickly and with the fewest resources to reach protein requirements. Mm-hmm.
But maybe that's for the panel, I don't know. So I agree with everything you said when you describe the situation, when you report facts. But in spite of that, I really disagree with your recommendation, policy recommendation. Like, for example, I think that I keep on thinking that calories is really the big issue in food security, and that it's the wrong way. It's the right way to go, not the wrong way to go. But there's a panel, so maybe that's better. Something to keep for the panel, right? Okay, so I will stop there.
So I would like to hear why you think that it would be a good idea going forward, because I think a lot of people agree with you. So we should have that conversation.
Okay, so in the panel.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And if the presenters for panel 1 and the moderator can join us on stage and can take a seat too. Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Good idea.
Hello. Can everybody hear me if I use that? I'd like to welcome everyone to the first panel of the meeting, which is called Beyond Yields, Food Security and Resilience. And the way the organizers have told me, the way this is going to work is that each talk will be 10 minutes, and then there will be 5 minutes for questions. If this is incorrect, one of the organizers let me know, because sometimes I just make things up. And then after all 3 talks, we will have a panel discussion for an hour or so. Our first speaker today is Selena Ahmed. Are you ready, Selena? Selena got her bachelor's degree in economics from Barnard College, and then she went and got a master's degree in ethnobotany from University of Kent. I think she brings a very interesting perspective to the study of the relationship between people and plants because of those 2 parts of her background. She's currently a lecturer at Dartmouth College. Wow, Selena, you have all this stuff. She's also a postdoctoral fellow at Tufts University, a visiting fellow at the Arnold Arboretum. I'd like to hear about that. And a foreign expert at Minzu University in Beijing. Selena also did her PhD with me as a professor. So I disavow any responsibility for anything that Selena would say. Her talk this morning is, I guess, is part of your doctoral work, right? Some of this
Part
stuff
of it, yes,
is in there?
absolutely.
Which is called Beyond Yields, Managing Tea Agroforests for Crop Quality, Food Security, and Climate Change Resilience. Selena Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you. I know, I'm so cold.
Selena, is this you? Is this yours?
No.
That one. Finns man, ja. Thank you, Dr. Peters, for the introduction. It's an honor to be here today to join in the dialogue on food and forests with a case study on tea agroforests. I'm going to be building on some of the framework that Dr. Harforth presented in the opening address. In 1999 to 2003, the Chinese government implemented one of the largest conservation programs in the world, which incorporated agricultural systems. And given the joint objectives of agriculture and conservation, it could also be a really great opportunity to target nutrition outcomes. And so in this talk, I'm going to present a case study that compares the Chinese government's Green for Grain program to some of the indigenous agricultural systems that were replaced or in some cases overlooked by this program. I'm specifically focusing on tea agroecosystems, where the Chinese government paid subsidies to farmers to replace indigenous systems with cash cropping, which was considered as forest cover by the government policy. So I conducted research in southwestern Yunnan province, near the border of Burma and Laos in Mang Khai County. This is part of the Indo-Burma hotspot of biodiversity. I was working with the Aka socio-linguistic group, and I was working in two neighboring communities that both historically managed tea agroforests, and then one in the past decade had transitioned to managing terrace tree plantations as part of the Green for Green program and had replaced their tea agroforests. So the talk starts off with beyond yields. And if we're looking just at yields, it's very clear why the Chinese government would promote an intensified terrace tree plantation and why farmers may even be attracted to converting their traditional indigenous systems to these modern terraces. There's more than 4 times the amount of yield if you're just talking about one single species within the system, which is tea, coming from the terraces. However, building on Dr. Harforth's framework of really moving beyond yield and integrating ecological and dietary indicators, we're going to be examining these systems based on several different parameters, including species diversity, structural and functional diversity, genetic diversity, dietary diversity, and one thing that I really focus on is phytochemical quality of the crops themselves. Just to give a little bit more context about the two communities that I'm working with, they both are have 100 households, and it's not just tea agroecosystems that they're managing, it's within a whole mosaic of other sorts of land use. So the community that primarily manages agroforests has about 32 different land use types, including forest and rice paddies and mixed crop fields. And the community that manages terrace plantations historically also had about 30 land use types, but more recently has really transitioned into more terrace tea and has intensified with that. So there's more simplification in the landscape with 11 land use types, but still it's a mosaic of different land uses. And just sort of looking at the structural complexity of ecological samples within these systems, the agroforest has much more of a forest system, which, as we all know, has is related to a lot of ecosystem services, such as pollination services, soil protection, watershed protection. And looking at it from a plant species perspective, plots within the agroforest and the forested buffer also shows that there's a lot more plant species diversity within the agroforest in addition to the terrace plantations. And focusing just on the food species, so here we see that there's about 228 species overall in the agroforested system, and 79 of those are specifically food plants. So we really expect greater dietary diversity from that community that's really relying on the agroforest system. And that represents about 35 different families. Some of the most represented are Fagaceae, Lauraceae, rosaceae, and moraceae. And so having this sort of rich diversity in the landscape, you would expect this to come onto the table and see lots of yummy dishes that really represent the local biodiversity, which is indeed the case, which I'll be talking about that. And so looking at not just species diversity, but also looking at genetic diversity, tea agroforests have wider genetic diversity than the monocultures, because those rely on clonal propagules, whereas farmers for the agroforest actually go out into wild forest populations where they take different germplasm of wild relatives and incorporate them into their agroforest. And this has resulted in a spread of traits that you can see just within a small tea agroforest. Farmers may manage up to 15 different varieties of tea that a botanist would identify all as one species, but they actually may have 15 different names for these, and they manage them for different characteristics. So sort of moving and linking the ecological indicators with the nutrition indicators, phytochemical quality is one really good way of doing this, because plants produce secondary metabolites as defense compounds. So these really have an environmental role. Plants won't produce them, and then unless they have the ecological cue to do so. So if you sort of remove the ecological cue to produce these secondary metabolites, plants won't be producing them. And as Dr. Herforth was saying, some of these phytochemicals also have been implicated in prevention of chronic disease. So this is one good indicator to sort of start to link environmental services with nutrition indicators. And so looking at, I did an HPLC analysis of tea samples from the two different systems for total catechin content. Catechins are the compounds that give the antioxidant properties of tea, and there was over twice the amount of antioxidant properties for tea samples from the agroforest compared to the terrace plantations. I also did this for methylxanthine compounds and saw the same thing. So methylxanthines are is like caffeine, and one of the reasons why tea is the most consumed beverage in the world after water. So the tea that's produced in this area is known as pu'er, and it really became popular about 10 years ago, where the prices of pu'er became quite exponential, and consumers really started to seek pu'er specifically from tea agroforest because of the phytochemical quality of this particular tea. And this is indicated very well in the price. This is the dollars per kilo of dried tea. So tea that was from terrace plantations and tea that was from agroforest had the same price about 2000, 2001, 2002. And then in 2003, consumer knowledge of the higher quality of agroforest tea led to this huge market demand, which really led to this new livelihoods that farmers are receiving. And despite this price bust that sort of happened in 2008 with this marketing of tea that traders marketed as being from agroforest and some sort of consumer unwillingness to pay, the market has bounced back, and consumers continue to pay a price premium for tea for agroforest. So this is some of the most expensive tea in the world. So markets are always changing, and farmers need to be cognizant of this. But also the environment is also continuously changing. So just in the past 50 years, farmers have already experienced a change in temperature and precipitation at the study site. During the spring harvest, there has already been 14% more precipitation rainfall than was expected that had happened 50 years ago. And then during the monsoons are also getting more extreme. So monsoons are really linked to the phytochemical quality of the tea. tea grown in the dry season is considered sort of the highest quality, and then there's this big drop in the phytochemistry when the monsoons hit, and this is linked to a reduction in farmer livelihoods when the prices are reduced by about a half. And so it's really important to sort of have ecological conditions and management conditions to grow tea in a way that it's not as vulnerable to climate risk with increased precipitation. And this is just looking at climate change expectations in the next 50 years. What's interesting is it's actually supposed to get drier in the dry season and wetter during the monsoon season. So here I sampled tea samples during the onset of the East Asian monsoon following one of the most severe droughts in recorded history in southern Yunnan. Then I sampled during the onset of the monsoon itself and then in the monsoon season. And then I sort of compare the phytochemical quality for these different periods as a proxy measure for climate change. Because we can't obviously measure how climate was 50 years ago. I'm also coupling this with greenhouse experiments manipulating climate change, but it's also important to sort of find a way in natural ecosystems to have extreme weather patterns that sort of mimic climate change. And here we saw that the decline of tea in both the systems declined. However, tea from agroforests had less of a decline in total catechin content than tea from terrace plantations, which I think is really interesting. So again, there was less of a quality drop during the monsoons because of the way agroforests are managed. And even though this talk is titled Beyond Yield, I do want to talk about yield over here because farmers reported that while tea from terraces had a decline because of the drought for about 1/2 to 1/3 less than they usually experience during the spring, tea from agroforests actually, farmers didn't really experience a drop in yields. So even though we're not talking about yield, agroforests actually had less of a hit for yield with the drought. So again, talking about the resilience of the structure of the system. And household surveys with farmers sort of indicated that farmers do have knowledge of management practices to sort of reduce climate vulnerability, maintaining canopy coverage, maintaining forested buffers around their agroecosystems, and really maintaining or cultivating tea plants as trees rather than shrubs really helps alleviate climate risk. So sort of this coupling of farmer knowledge, climate variability, and agroecosystems really centered around tea quality, and the prices that farmers receive for higher quality have really enabled farmers to sort of conserve the biological diversity in their ecosystems. So I have just a minute left, so we're going to sort of skip the dietary diversity slides, but I just want to sort of leave you with this thought. What would it mean if giant policies such as the Grain for Green policy, instead of sort of promoting a system like this, what would it mean for conservation and nutrition, and how feasible would it be if it promoted a system like this? Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Can you talk a little more about the price differential between the agroforestry tea and the terrace tea, and what the market was for the 10 times higher price tea, and how that could influence local availability of tea if it all kind of had a higher price?
So can you repeat the two parts of your question?
What the market was for the higher price tea and the implications for local markets if the tea is all higher priced, if it all moved towards the agroforestry system.
Okay, so sort of the market for the tea, there was not so much of a price differential between and terrace tea, and then in 2000, pesticides and herbicides, which is what a terrace monoculture has, whereas the agroforest really relies on the ecosystem services and doesn't have these chemical inputs. So people began to look for other types of tea or tea grown in a different way that doesn't have this. And so that's one reason why the differential started to occur between agroforest and terrace plantation. So it was really consumer knowledge of understanding the quality difference. And then the second factor at play was really government promotion of tea. So that was a sustainable development effort to promote tea. So the government had a lot of infrastructure in Yunnan province to enable the market to grow. So it's really the coupling of consumer knowledge as well as sort of government promotion of tea that enabled that sort of price structure to develop that way. And then the second part of your question, yes. So what has that meant for local tea production? Tea has greatly expanded within Yunnan, sort of a teaification process. And in the two different sites that I was working at, the site that manages agroforest are expanding their agroforests, tea agroforest, and the sites that sort of have terrace tea plantations aren't increasing those anymore. So even though now there's this big price difference, it's a lot easier to sell tea from an agroforest than it is to sell tea from a monoculture.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you had a biophysical explanation for why you're finding these biochemical differences between the two types of tea. Thank you.
Sure. I'll open it out to any other theories in the audience first. Why would tea from an agroforest produce more phytochemicals than tea from a terrace plantation? Sort of thinking back to these phytochemicals being defense compounds that the plant produces that are expensive for the plant to produce, and they'll only produce it if they have sort of the ecological cue to do so. So why would you expect an agroforest to have more of these compounds? Anybody want to answer that? Yes, Dr. Peters. So cool.
I don't think it's really a straight answer to that, because if you in a plantation, it's just all the same thing. So it's like a huge supermarket for a predator. Whereas what some ecological theory would tell you is that by hiding yourself among 200 other species of plants, you can somehow avoid predation and not have to invest that energy to produce phytochemicals. That said, what is the answer?
So that's going in the right direction. So my theory is that plants in the agro or in the terrace plantation don't have the ecological cue to produce these compounds because they have pesticides, and so they don't need to produce these expensive compounds because they're kind of being pampered. And if they don't have pesticides, the plants will be defoliated. So that's my theory. Mm-hmm.
That are used for defense mechanisms. Are phytochemicals kind of the same way, where near neighbors can cue each other in to produce them in the event of predation?
Yes. So the particular compounds that I quantified are not those type of, they're not aromatic compounds, but it could be within the soil. There can be communication with other plants. Yes.
Yeah, so the income that each system is going to produce will depend on the yield, but also on the area, how many hectares you can do with each system. Depends on the price, depends on the subsidy you get from the government. Then there's also the risk issue, etc. So in the end, which system provides more income potentially to the farmers? And which system do the farmers prefer? And if they prefer the new system, if they put low value on the future benefit of being resilient, for example, and if they prefer to have straight right now good income in case it provides more income. So if they prefer the new system, what should we do? And that goes together with that question. I would not expect that they could plant the same area of tea with the new system than with the old one, because the new system is more intensive. I guess it requires more labor. So it might be that they could not anyway convert all the land into the new system just because of labor requirements. So what about combining the two systems? And talking about resilience, diversity is also combining different systems together. So what about also this option?
Absolutely. Thank you for your questions. You might have to remind me some of your questions. So to start off with, which system sort of wins? Absolutely, the agroforest system wins in terms of income. Farmers receive more than 10 to 15 times the amount of income. And it's not just the price of the tea, but it's also the demand for the tea. The farmers that grow the terrace tea, they can't sell a lot of their tea every year now. There's sort of a over infiltration of too much terrace tea in the market in Yunnan. But with the agroforest, it's actually not enough. So there is just, it gets sold all the time. There's just not enough. So there really is a need in terms of demand to expand the agroforest system. So certainly in terms of income, the agroforestry system wins. And in terms of farmer sort of preferences for the systems, so they're both Aka communities that I worked with, and they do prefer the traditional agroforest system. It really is part of their cultural identity. It's sort of agrarian management practices that resonate with what they've been doing historically. So I think such a system does take into consideration the cultural context of the farmers. And why did the other farmers sort of transition to the new system? Part of that is because it was a sort of the price differential wasn't that big when the program was implemented, and so farmers, you're not sure what's going to happen. But now what I'm seeing when I go back to Yunnan is that actually farmers that once had agroforests had converted them into these monocultures are actually starting to convert them back into, they're like removing their clonal propagules, starting to put in their traditional seed, their traditional land races. So there is the landscape is really fluid, which is good to see.
So they were forced actually by the government?
They weren't forced, they were offered. They were offered to participate in this program. So there was some land use changes that had happened that some of the traditional systems weren't allowed to be implemented, but they were sort of offered these subsidies.
So they did it to get the subsidy, and now the subsidy is gone? Or?
The subsidies are gone. So yeah, the subsidies were like a 10-year, yeah.
Okay, our next speaker is Sarah Osterhout, and she's a Coleman Fellow here in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and she is a doctoral student in the joint program between the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Department of Anthropology at Yale. I'm also on her committee. This is like, I know. The title of her talk is Food, Forest, Markets, Meanings, Vanilla Agroforestry Systems of Northeastern Madagascar. Please be very kind to Sarah. She just broke her foot. Sarah?
Dr. Peters. Can you hear me? As if there's not enough pressure, I'll try to do this balancing on one foot. So we'll see how it goes. You have to turn on our mic. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for the organizers of the conference for putting together such a great event and for inviting me to speak. This morning I will discuss some of my dissertation research, which examines the environmental and the cultural dimensions of vanilla and clove agroforestry systems in the Mananara region of northeastern Madagascar. So the Mananara region is within Madagascar's rainforest corridor, which stretches up the east coast. Families in this area are mostly smallholder farmers who usually own about 3 or 4 parcels of land on hillsides that they cultivate as agroforestry systems. These are great systems. They integrate subsistence crops, market crops, fruit trees, timber trees, firewood species, and medicinal plants. The main market crops in Mananara are vanilla and cloves. They are cultivated only for export markets and have been in the area more or less about 80 years. They also farm rice in this area, often in lowland rice paddies that are irrigated, but also as swidden systems on hillsides. This rice that people grow, they supplement with rice that they buy using the income from cloves and vanilla. And this income is also used for other food security measures, such as buying dried beans and other things to eat. So I'll admit up front that I am an anthropologist, and most of my field research is doing anthropology and ethnography with these small-scale farmers. But while I was conducting my field research in anthropology, I was so struck by how amazing these systems seem to me and diverse these agroforestry systems. Looking on the middle slide, we're not looking over a protected area or any sort of park. These are managed forest agricultural systems. And that little bit of green in the middle you see is rice. And I knew, though, if I came back as an anthropologist and said, oh, what pretty forest, that might not carry much weight. So I really wanted to look at what was going on in these agroforestry systems more systematically. To do this, I conducted surveys of agroforestry fields that farmers manage for vanilla and cloves. I worked with 7 farmers. We surveyed 5 10 by 10 meter plots in the vanilla gardens for each farmer, giving a total of 35 plots. We also collected specimens for each species, which we identified with help from botanists at the University of Antananarivo. Go over quickly some of the results. Of these 7 farmers, we recorded 89 different tree species with a DBH greater than 5 centimeters. If you add in the tree species that were poles with a height over 2 meters and a DBH of less than 5 centimeters, this total species of trees goes to 97 tree species. These trees represent 39 different families. About 35% of these species are native and or endemic. I also spoke with people about the uses of each of these types of trees. People cited at least one cultural or environmental use for all 97 tree species. Many of these were subsistence purposes, such as fruit trees, jackfruit, mango, lychee, breadfruit, and avocado, for example. They also contained palm species, included coconuts and raffia. The raffia is in the middle here. It's a palm that's used to construct homes and also for weaving mats and baskets. There's also a lot of trees used for construction, furniture making, and firewood, and also medicinal uses. And not all of the uses that people told me about were utilitarian. There was also a lot of ecological roles people told me that the trees were playing in their fields, such as soil improvement, bird habitat, or lemur foods. An example is this tree on the right called Ancavia, which is an endemic tree that provides food for birds. And Ancavia is often used as a vanilla tutor tree as well. Which brings me to vanilla tutor trees. So vanilla is an orchid, actually. It's native to Mesoamerica, and it's extremely labor intensive and very difficult to cultivate. It requires a precise blend of shade and sun throughout its growing cycle. All the flowers have to be hand pollinated. When people cultivate them, they wrap them around trees that are called tutor trees. And these are living trees that support the vine and grow with the vine. A good tutor tree is relatively small in diameter and about 2 meters in height. This is a view of a typical vanilla garden, and those are the tutor trees. And these represent a significant number of stems. On average, the farmers I surveyed had 700 vanilla vines or so growing in these 5 parcels, and each vanilla vine needs its own tutor tree, so that's 700 stems. In the fields I surveyed, the tree called Olivra, which is Pachera glabra of Bombaceae, was the most prevalent tutor tree. Overall, though, 73 different types of trees were used at least once as a vanilla tutor. I also looked at importance values for each tree species and for each farmer, which takes into account the relative number, frequency, and basal area. This is data from farmer 1, from some of data from her field. And cloves is her most important species, followed by the Tudor tree olivera. And these results are indicative of many of the farmers. Other important value species were jackfruit, coconut coffee, and the endemic tree Ampali of the Mauricie. So there was some variation among farmers regarding the number of tree species in their fields. Shown here, for example, farmer 6, or farmer 5, that's Martin, managed 59 of the 89 species, while farmer 7, this is Frantine shown here, had a lower diversity of 17 types of trees, which is still impressive, actually, to manage. Although she had fewer number of species, she did have some interesting things in her field, including black pepper and cacao, which used to be crops of commercial value in the region, but aren't anymore. And she was the only one that still had cacao growing in her fields of the fields I surveyed, which raises an interesting point. While there are a dozen or so tree species found in all farmers' fields, like coffee, coconut, etc., the tree species profile for the rest of the species really varied depending on the farmer. In short, each farmer had kind of favorite trees that they would encourage. And this preference encourages an overall landscape diversity when you're taken across a more regional scale. Also looked at rank abundance curves. You can see it here for each of the 7 farmers. And looking at these curves, they're very similar to what we would expect to find in what we think of as, quote, natural forests, which show this long curve at the end. This illustrates that there are a lot of species that are only represented by 1 or 2 individuals. And overall, this kind of curve suggests that the forest is resilient to disruption and change. And while we look at these curves and think of Mananara, it's important to note that Mananara is no stranger to disruption and change. It's right in the path of violent cyclones. It has periods of drought and flooding. In addition to environmental disturbances, there's lots of market fluctuations. Vanilla especially is an extremely volatile and unpredictable market. And there's also, I should add, political disturbances, such as the recent coup. So what can we conclude from these studies? Madagascar receives a lot of attention for its high rates of biodiversity and endemism, especially in this rainforest corridor of the East Coast. This diversity, we hear, is extremely threatened, most notably by small-scale farmers who practice swidden agriculture. Another cited threat to forests is the introduction of cash crops, which are often assumed to encourage monocrop systems that erode both cultural and environmental diversity. But the vanilla and clove forests of Mananara challenge these ideas, these preconceptions. Here in Mananara, market crops are cultivated in diverse systems that have many of the same ecological characteristics of natural forests. Farmers keep their commitment to diverse landscapes even in the face of extreme market fluctuations. This challenges the assumption that farmers will abandon market crops when commodity prices fall, or that when commodity prices spike up, that they'll just go and clear their fields and only plant this one important market crop. Another protest people say about agroforestry fields is, yeah, these are fine, they're sort of cute, but there's no way these systems can meet global demands for commodities. They can't produce commodities on a global scale. And again, Mananara overturns this myth. Mananara is a huge producer of cloves, actually. It's the largest production region in Madagascar, and Madagascar is one of the largest clove exporters in the world. And this production is meant only by small-scale farmers who collect cloves by hand, bud by bud, in goonies that go by dugout canoe to pickups to market. There are no clove plantations in this region. So overall, the vanilla and clove forests of Mananara tell an optimistic story of cultivation systems that are able to balance cash crops and subsistence crops while maintaining the land ownership of small-scale farmers, as well as encouraging forest cover and biodiversity. So, how do they do it? Why have such diverse, robust, and successful agroforestry systems developed in this region? It's a complicated question, and one I look at a lot in my dissertation, where I say we must look at these landscapes not only as environmental landscapes, but as cultural landscapes and ideological landscapes. These are landscapes that not only have a diversity of materials, but also of meanings. And hopefully you'll read more in my dissertation, which I promise is coming any day now. But for today, I'll just leave with the short answer that it happens slowly. People in Mananara describe themselves as tree farmers. Tree farming is a patient enterprise. They speak with pride about these landscapes, which they call alambuli, which is planted forest. Farmers understand the nature of commodity prices that they've seen over time go up and down and up again. They are no stranger to cyclones and hungry seasons, and they know the value of having backup plans and backup plans to these backup plans for food and for income. This valuing of diversity is expressed by a proverb that people often cited to me in my field research. Kakazu marisefika ilatsahana mananeki. If you are climbing a tree with many branches, you will never have far to fall. Thank you. Thanks, it's a great question. So in a lot of Madagascar, the main vanilla producing region of Madagascar is a little north of Mananara in what's called the Sava region. And there you do see mostly vanilla plantations, which are farmed in what's called a stabex, is what they call it, formation where there are still the Tudor trees, but usually only one or two species of Tudor trees, often Gracilda.